Well, good afternoon and welcome to the latest broadcast from MEED. Today we're going to be looking at the energy transition in the Middle East. My name is Richard Thompson. I am the editorial director of MEED and I will be the host and presenter for today's broadcast. Over the next hour, what we will do is we will use a mixture of slides and discussion to look at what the energy transition means for the Middle East oil producers. So we will look at the definition of what is energy transition. We will look at how that shapes and is reshaping energy policy across the Middle East and North Africa. We will spend some time digging into the renewables projects market, which is obviously a major area of, and has been a major area of investment for some time. And then we will look at some new technologies such as green hydrogen, which is quite a hot topic at the moment. And then we will shift gear and look at the oil and gas sector and what the energy transition means for the region's national oil companies. So we've got a lot to get through. I do encourage you to send in your questions or your comments. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Send in your questions and we will try and answer them. And to answer your questions, I'm delighted that I am joined today by my colleagues at MEED. Jennifer Aguinaldo is the Energy and Technology Editor for MEED. And Jenny will be taking us through some of the issues around green hydrogen, around renewables and around utilities. And I'm also delighted that we're joined by Indrajit Sen. Indrajit is MEED's Oil and Gas Editor. And we will spend some time looking at the national oil companies in the region and what the energy transition means for them. So please get involved in the conversation, send in your questions for Indrajit and for Jennifer. Okay, I'd like to let you know as well about a new report from MEED. This broadcast is timed to coincide with the launch of a report called Middle East Energy Transition. It's from the MEED Insight team and it looks at exactly the same topic as the discussion today. It looks at the key players, the key policies, the key projects, and some of the opportunities and challenges for business and investment and government in the region as it tries to get ahead of the energy transition and the decarbonisation agenda. And you can find out more about the report on the links that you can see on your screen now. There's a free bundle of content to give you some sample pages, and there's also a special offer linking to the MEED subscription. Now, you should have received an email directly from me in the last few minutes with these links in your email. So if you check your inbox, you can find out more about the report and these special offers. Okay, so I want to just start off with, I thought we'll just have a look at what is happening in the Middle East regarding energy transition. So I went on to MEED.com last night. These 8 stories I've selected them. They've all been published in the last 7 days, just in the last week on MEED.com, and they all are energy transition related, and there are other things going on even beyond these. So we have in the top left, we have a deal to provide a fleet of green hydrogen powered buses in Egypt, sorry, the second one. Helios Eyes 2022 construction. This is the $5 billion Helios green ammonia project in Neom in Saudi Arabia, a massive investment project in that new city. As we move along, we can see Qatar's biggest solar project is on track for commissioning. And then an interesting commentary piece from Jenny about decarbonisation agenda presents a crossroads for many companies who've been focused on EPC work in the oil and gas sector, and they now have environmental criteria to think about, and companies need to think what are their areas of focus. As we get onto the bottom row, we have a comment on the impact of inflation on the renewables sector. We've seen bottlenecks in the solar PV panel supply chain and in other commodities have pushed up inflation sharply up in many cases in the first half of 2021. What does that mean for solar in particular, but other green projects which have been benefiting from a cost advantage over the past few years? Morocco weighs in with its next hybrid solar. This is a mixture of photovoltaic and concentrated solar power, a hybrid project. And then as we move along, the Sudair solar project, 1,500 megawatt solar plant in Saudi Arabia, huge project. And then Abu Dhabi has recently just announced tariffs for electric vehicles. So that's all happened in the last week, and all of those relate to this shift away, this energy transition. So I want to just summarize what we mean when we're talking about the energy transition. So I've got some bullet points on this slide. So in broad terms, and this is not an academic definition, but in broad terms, we're talking about the shift away from fossil fuels as the world's primary energy source. We're talking about action to combat climate change. We're talking about decarbonizing the economy, so reducing our greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide emissions without restricting economic growth and development. We're talking about energy security. Fossil fuels are a finite resource, and we're talking about energy diversification into new areas. We're talking about conserving energy, being more efficient using technology to help us be more efficient with our energy. In November, we have COP26, the latest round of the Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, my home city, and that is going to be a review of where we are in relation to the COP21 Paris targets. Sorry, I can see Indrajit, you've just raised your hand. Did you want to come in? You're on.
Sorry, that may have been by mistake, but I mean, I just wanted to say that you mentioned oil and gas as a finite resource. Well, is it really, considering the exploration efforts going on in the region? I mean, obviously, the more you explore, the more you'll find. And I mean, obviously, given the oil price cycle that we are in currently, obviously, there is Saudi Aramco and ADNOC, which are carrying on exploration efforts. And the resource breadth in these countries is constantly growing as we get more seismic imagery and 3D imaging.
Well, I think that's a very important point. I mean, one of the points we'll get onto later on is the question of peak oil, the sort of if and when there will be a slowdown in growth for oil demand globally, but also how finite are our hydrocarbon reserves as technology brings the costs down of accessing more complex structures. Is that actually part of the story that we haven't really focused on so far? So good point, Indrajit. We'll come back to that in the second half of the discussion on oil and gas. The final point on this slide that I wanted to make was actually about ESG, so environmental, social, and governance criteria. That is now a priority for institutional investors around the world, and in a region that wants to attract international investment. That is a significant factor in I guess the PR for the region, or the marketing of the region. So that's what we're talking about, energy transition. Why is it important to the Middle East? Well, the Middle East is central to the global energy story. It's the hub for oil and gas production and supply for the world. The GCC is the world's biggest exporter of oil and gas. The economies of the GCC are dependent on hydrocarbons revenues, and the region has grown on abundant, cheap, and easy energy, where this has allowed the state to support low-cost water, low-cost electricity to allow urbanization, expansion, and economic expansion. However, that is patently unsustainable, both environmentally and fiscally. We are guilty of chronic overconsumption in this region as a result of the subsidies, and the GCC is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in per capita terms in the world. Whilst it might be small compared to China or the US in absolute terms, per capita it's the biggest emitter. I've made the point again here about finite oil and gas reserves, which Indrajit will no doubt come back to later on in the discussion. But another key reason is for this region to be important, take notice of energy transition, is the exposure of this region to volatility in the energy markets. We also, and by that I mean falling oil prices affect GDP growth and revenues for the region. Changing customer demands in the core client markets, the US and the EU, for this region, that changes focus of this region eastwards, away from those traditional wet markets. And also there's the issue of bad PR. So ESG is shaping investment, and cost of finance is likely to be cheaper in the long run where you have good ESG policies and criteria. Okay, so next slide. Now, so how is the energy transition changing national objectives? Well, I've sort of broken this into two parts. I've looked at past energy policy priorities, and then I've looked at energy transition, what it means for new energy priorities. So past priorities have been increasing oil and gas production, and that's to meet domestic needs and also to maximize export potential, whether it's from crude oil, refined oil, or higher value petrochemicals products. And a lot of the investment upstream and downstream has been all about that, ensuring there's adequate water and electricity capacity domestically with a comfortable reserve margin, and also maximizing export revenues. For Saudi Arabia, there has been the additional responsibility of reducing energy market volatility as the swing producer for the world, managing output. And we've seen that being particularly important over the past 3 or 4 years. And then there's the relationship with the US and the energy and the security equation that relates to this region being a supplier of oil to the US historically. So that's in the past. What does it mean going forward? Well, one change in policy is the diversification of energy sources into beyond oil and gas, conserving hydrocarbon reserves in the ground to extend the life and also to maximize the potential of those reserves, reducing carbon footprint through clean tech and reduced consumption, changing geopolitical relations, the shift east from west to China, to Russia, and even relations with Israel. We've seen the Abraham Accords signed in the past year, reflecting that changing dynamic. And I think we're also, this region wants to play a very leading role, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar want to play a leadership role in shaping the global energy conversation going forward through investment around the world in clean tech and renewables, but also through policy in the region. And I think the increased engagement with China as a client for Middle East oil and gas, as a supplier for solar panels, for example, as a trade partner, and as a financier of infrastructure projects. So those are the new policy priorities. Now, we're going to shift now onto renewable sector, and I'll run through a couple of slides briefly, and then I want to bring Jenny in, MEED's energy and technology editor, to sort of give her thoughts. So the slide in front of you now presents the renewable energy targets for the MENA region governments. We can see the 2020 installed capacity, renewables installed capacity as a percentage of overall installed power generation capacity. And then we have the 2030 figures on the right. Now, electricity demand is rising at about 5% a year across the region, but diversification of energy sources is a key priority, and most countries have very high ambitious clean energy targets, with many aiming for over 20% of clean energy by 2030, Dubai aiming for 75% by 2050. So that's the sort of targets. And then just before I bring Jenny in, this is a look at the project pipeline for renewables projects. As I mentioned, most countries are pursuing solar and wind projects. This has been boosted by falling technology costs over the long term. In the recent times, we've actually seen costs going up a bit, partly as a result of COVID and the sort of bottleneck in the supply chains. Saudi Arabia, now on the bar chart, the red bars show the pipeline of projects under study. And you can see Algerias has got the biggest pipeline of projects under study, but those have been there for years and have never moved. The reality is that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco, and the UAE are probably much more interesting markets in terms of real projects coming forward quickly. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, you can see on the bar chart, there is an orange bar which represents the projects that have gone beyond the design stage into the tendering and bidding stage. And Saudi, by far, is the most active. It's definitely got the hottest pipeline of opportunities, about $13 billion worth of renewables projects at the tendering stage. So those are my two slides on renewables. Jenny, if I can just bring you in, perhaps we can start with what your thoughts are on energy targets, clean energy targets for the region. You know, are we going to hit them? Are people serious about them?
Yeah, well, thank you, Richard. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So in terms of, well, it's very interestingly, the targets would range from, let's say, 10% in Bahrain, which is a small country and where utility scale renewable energy has faced major limitations because of the size of the country. So from 10% in Bahrain to 52% in Morocco or in Saudi Arabia by 2030 or 2035. So in answer to your questions, I mean, today we're seeing some of the countries with advanced programs like Morocco and Jordan posing the next rounds of their procurement, of their capacity procurement plans, mainly due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on electricity demand, among other reasons. Whereas the opposite trend can be seen in Saudi Arabia and other countries like Kuwait, which are ramping up their planned procurement rounds simply because they have lagged behind their targets. So I agree. In terms of total installed capacity, we've got around anywhere between around 11 to 12 gigawatts of installed capacity. And based on our data, we have about 11 gigawatts under construction, including the 3 gigawatts that were awarded in April in Saudi Arabia. So correct, Saudi Arabia is primarily the source of biggest opportunities over the next say 12, 18 months. And then you have projects being launched across the region. You've seen Iraq signing an MOU with Masdar to develop 2 gigawatts of renewable energy projects in the country. Again, the question is, they have not yet so far successfully implemented any renewable energy IPP in the country before, but we do know that there's an intention to pursue this path. So they are in very different stages, I guess, in terms of implementation of their targets. But yes, they do have intentions to increase the share of clean renewable energy as part of their commitment to their Paris Agreement. And of course, we have UAE leading the countries in terms of commitments in meeting those, in bringing greenhouse gas emissions down, among others.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned Masdar and you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and through Aqua Power in Saudi Arabia, through Masdar in the UAE, we're seeing these two countries investing outside the region as well as in the region. Is that something you expect to see more of from the governments here? You know, Saudi Arabia wants to be a leader in the global energy transition. So does Abu Dhabi. Can we expect to see more of that?
I mean, Aqua Power basically wants to balance its risk, right? So it wanted 50% of its business, of its net capacity, to be from outside Saudi Arabia at some point, maybe during the next few years, which explains why it's expanding its footprint outside of the GCC and outside of Saudi Arabia. And it's the same with Masdar, which is still in a growth mode and pursuing opportunities everywhere. The two companies are also competing directly with each other, let's say in countries like Azerbaijan, in Central Asia. So that's part of their mandate to promote renewable energy, and especially for Masdar.
One other important topic, I think one of the drivers or the key success factors for renewables over the past few years has been the reducing costs. Mm-hmm. You know, the cost of photovoltaic cells has come down, and all the technology costs, etc. Costs are now going up again. How important is that? Could the whole thing be derailed by inflation?
I don't know the exact answer, but from what the market is telling us, we do know that the expectation is that the commodities prices commodity prices increase will be a temporary trend due to the supply chain constraints, primarily in China. So so I think the long term, I don't think. Of course, there are economic considerations, and these projects need to be profitable. But I think the long term objective of increasing the share of renewable and clean energy against the overall energy mix for electricity production stays. So from what we're hearing, for sure there are projects in Saudi Arabia that were awarded in April, right? In the middle of this increase in polysilicon prices. So we're not seeing any cancellations or there's some extension, I think, in terms of negotiations for financial close for some of the projects. It may be related to the prices, may be related to land issues, but yeah, I think in general there's a wait. There might be a wait and see mode in terms of when they start actual construction, but right now these projects we see are mobilizing as we speak. So I don't see that this price having a very significant impact in terms of new renewable projects.
And we've got, I do invite everyone watching to send in questions if you have any. We have quite a few have come in so far, and there's one here, Jennifer, that relates to what you were just talking about. So I will read the question. Can you talk about the cost of producing energy from renewables, and is there a trend lower? So we just touched on the sort of short-term bottleneck.
Okay,
but
so
yeah.
So the Shuaiba solar IPP in Saudi Arabia basically set the world record of lowest tariff in terms of unsubsidized solar production at 1.01 cents a kilowatt hour. So that I guess the question is, will that continue to go down, given that one of the main reasons of these projects achieving such low tariff is the cost of technology. So with prices going up, I think that's the question everyone wants an answer for today. We have not seen, after April, when Saudi Arabia awarded those 7 contracts with a total of 3 gigawatts, nearly 3 gigawatts of solar capacity, we have not seen new contract awards since then. However, we've also seen that Al Dhafra in Saudi Arabia, 2 gigawatt solar capacity in Al Dhafra, they've broken ground in the project. So to answer the question, when the price was 1.35 cents a kilowatt hour, the consensus was there's room to further bring that price down. And then Saudi Arabia came up with 1.01. Can we go under 1 cent? 1 cent? Perhaps, but it all depends on the size of solar PV projects that will be purchased, in terms of the size of those projects. Yeah. To be able to secure that kind of cost. So
okay, I'm going to stop you there, Jenny, because we've got a lot of questions coming in on hydrogen, and we've got some slides. So I'll just move on through the slide deck a little bit, and I'll bring you back in a moment. So the energy transition has got huge ramifications for utilities companies. You know, the companies, big centralized government-run entities to provide electricity to national grids. If we are using diversified energy sources, if we're using rooftop solar to feed into the national grids, if we're moving away from conventional fuel sources, this all has ramification for the utilities. And on the slide here, Jenny, I don't know, just quickly, these are bullet points largely taken from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association. Is your sense that the utilities in this region, so you know, DEWA and Saudi Electricity Company, they're all going to face massive challenges as they try and adjust?
Yeah, well, so if some of our audience has read EWEC's latest capacity procurement forecast, they basically said there will be no more. They don't foresee a need for more gas-fired capacity until 2029, I think. That's because there is a major gas-fired power plant in Fujairah that's under construction. So and then you see other utilities, let's say Saudi Arabia. So it's starting, it's ramping up a renewable energy procurement, but on the one hand, it's also launching a massive two IPP projects, gas-fired projects in Taiba and Al Qasim. These are 7 gigawatt projects. So again, there are commitments to decarbonize the energy system, and then there's also that reality where number one, they need to secure energy they need to have energy security by having non-intermittent power as well to support this. So there's also nuclear power. So you see Egypt and the UAE first 1.4 gigawatt nuclear reactor coming online this year, and the next one probably by the end of this year. So it's basically the UAE is at the forefront of this renewable and of this energy transition, and the other countries are basically starting, let's say, on that pathway of having more variable renewable energy on their energy system. But in terms of the role of utilities, I think it will evolve over time, but right now it's still there's hardly any change in jurisdictions outside the UAE so far, in my opinion. I could be wrong.
The other factor, of course, is new technologies. The utilities need to adapt to things like storage, battery storage, to smart grids, to rooftop solar, the threat of cyber attacks from digitalization. Do you anticipate that we're going to see sort of convulsions within the utility sector as they try and restructure and hire tech people and data people and integrate rooftop solar into their grids and things like that?
No, not a convulsion by any measure, but again, the UN, the latest climate report might just provide the necessary impetus for more projects, for more initiatives that will diversify the energy systems of these countries. And then you've mentioned COP26 that's happening in Glasgow next month. We do know that many countries have already submitted the second round of their nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement. So the UAE basically already submitted its second NDCs, which is to lower its carbon emissions by 23.5% in 2030 compared to business as usual, take renewable capacity to 14 gigawatts by 2030. So the UAE is leading the rest of the countries in terms of coming up with projects and initiatives to support their climate change commitment. We're seeing other countries announcing projects and to some extent implementing projects that would support this, but I think the general consensus that they're not yet doing enough, and they need to do more in order to cut emissions deeper and stronger than before.
Okay, we've got a question here for you, Jenny, about what are the forecasts on regulating residential sale to grids, so feed-in tariffs and things like that. Is this, Egypt has been trying to get the feed-in tariff program up and running for a long time. Do you see that being something that we can expect across the region in the coming years, or have things gone a bit cold on that?
I think this is a rapidly evolving sector. I mean, so there Egypt, even Dubai has a feed-in tariff system, and they've been to a certain those projects have achieved some success, I think. But although this year we've seen, I think, Dubai put a cap in terms of the capacity of rooftop solar projects, and I think that's because they need to secure the grid. So it's the same whether in Jordan or Egypt, you need to be able to have the infrastructure ready to accommodate that much of renewable energy. So yeah,
it's a technical challenge as well as a regulatory challenge. let me just move on then, Jenny, because we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and I know that we could talk on any of this for a long time. I wanted to look, just sort of give an idea of who the key players are in the Middle East energy transition. And so this slide shows some of the logos, and Indrajit and Jenny and I sort of worked together on this. This isn't a comprehensive list, but it's the sort of the organizations that we think are having a lot of influence at the moment. And Jenny has already talked about Aquapower and Masdar as developers. And of course, Aquapower is 51% owned by the Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia. So that's essentially a government entity now driving clean energy, clean tech and renewables in the region. And as Jenny said, it wants to build a portfolio that's 50% outside the region and around the world as well. Masdar in Abu Dhabi is slightly different to Aquapower. It's government owned by Mubadala, the sovereign fund. It's sort of an academic center as well as a developer of projects, and particularly investing in clean tech development around the world and increasingly getting into larger scale power projects. But we also have the utilities such as DEWA and BIA in Sharjah, DEWA in Dubai, who are sort of sponsors for exploratory projects. BIA is pushing and promoting waste to energy projects. DEWA, in common with Dubai generally, is looking at whatever it can to sort of push the boundaries, and it's pioneering. It's got a pilot project on green hydrogen that it's just announced or just completed with Siemens at the Mohammed bin Rashid Solar Park. In terms of countries, we've talked about Saudi and the UAE, but Jenny's quite keen, when we were discussing this, to point out that Morocco and Jordan and Egypt are also leading activists in the region in promoting solar and in Egypt wind, and Jordan looking at things like battery storage. And then I've mentioned at the bottom of the screen here, Emirates Global Aluminium and Emirates Steel. I think this industrial sector is a very important part of the energy transition story. Emirates Global Aluminium is one of the world's biggest aluminium producers. And in a recent MEED webinar, we heard from EGA that because their clients, in this case, I think it was BMW or Audi, one of the German car manufacturers, because the customers of those cars wanted clean, green cars, EGA as a supplier has to supply low carbon footprint, net zero products and aluminium to its customers, which means it pushes down the supply chain, demanding lower carbon footprint from its suppliers. And Emirates Steel also is looking at this, and I think other industrial producers across the region. So I think the industrial giants like EGA and Emirates Steel will be important actors pushing down decarbonisation through the manufacturing supply chain in the region. And I've mentioned on the right-hand side, you've got Aramco's logo, ADNOC's logo, and OQ in Oman, the national oil company, is absolutely fundamental to this story, and Indrajit will talk about those in a moment. Now, we've had a lot of questions on hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen. I'm going to hand over to Jenny again. This table shows the hydrogen projects that have been announced. Some of not all of them, there's probably one or two that have missed out. The ones highlighted in blue are the blue hydrogen projects. So those are using hydrocarbons to produce hydrogen. The others are green hydrogen or green ammonia projects, which use renewable energy and clean energy to fuel the catalytic converters and the electrolysis to produce the hydrogen fuel from water. So Jenny, let's get into this. A lot of questions. Green hydrogen, is this real, or are these just kind of promises that will never come to anything?
Well, if I know the answer, I wouldn't be here. In terms, I guess there are a lot. So if we start the discussion with this slide, you've got around 19 projects now. Most of them are pilot projects, but we've got a couple of projects that are that have gone beyond studies and planning and are in the early design stages. And one of them, Hyport Duqm, has signed an offtake agreement for the hydrogen or ammonia that will be produced from the plant. And we also hear that Aquapower and its partners are nearing finalizing the offtake agreement for the NEOM Green Helios projects. So I think the main question, so we know for sure that the value of planned projects has increased from 5 billion in July last year, when the NEOM Green Helios Fuels project was announced of around $47 billion today, and that includes the $28 billion planned project announced in Oman. But I think the main issue here is economics, right? So right now, green hydrogen still produced at a cost of 2 to 3 times more compared to blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen. Although hypothetically, if we were producing green hydrogen today from the Middle East at a cost close in Shuaiba at 1 cent a kilowatt hour, then you're already almost within that blue hydrogen range. However, we say it's hypothetical because number one, we have yet to have a large scale plant today. And we're probably maybe months or years away from having a large scale plant operating here, exporting products to Europe or Asia. That's mainly because the offtake agreements are crucial to have the investors sign off the projects. And that's the real test for any project, as experts tell us. So we need those two things to happen, so the cost, given the price of renewable energy here, can be brought closer and more competitive to blue hydrogen. But there are questions about what is the final cost to the consumer, because there's handling costs, and then of course there's the major consideration where there has got to be a significant carbon pricing in the destination market. But even though we've seen, of course, and I know hydrogen, Indrajit, sorry, did I call you hydrogen, Indrajit? Indrajit will have his own point of view in terms of what's been actually happening in terms of blue hydrogen in the region.
Yeah, just a couple of questions for you, Jenny. Sorry, Indrajit, did you want to say something?
I'll just make a very quick comment about this one Saudi project that you've highlighted in blue. Obviously, it's still in the conceptual phase, and I'm referring to the Aramco project with Hyundai Heavy Industries holding company. It's a very interesting project in the fact that it's actually relying on a give and take model. So the terms of the agreement states that Hyundai will actually be importing LPG, liquefied petroleum gas from Aramco, to produce blue hydrogen. And the carbon captured and sequestered in the process will actually be shipped back to Saudi Arabia, to Aramco, to be actually used in carbon-based enhanced oil recovery. So any sort of carbon emissions that are actually produced in the process of producing that blue hydrogen will also be used in sort of going back to the start of the value chain, which is in oil production. So it's a very interesting model in that regard.
Okay, I've got 2 questions we're going to put to you both about hydrogen. Then I'm going to move on to you, Indrajit, to look at the national oil companies. Firstly, Jenny, you were talking about the costs of hydrogen. So there is a question here that's come from somebody. How far away are we from hydrogen and other renewables being cost-efficient alternatives to hydrocarbons, both oil and gas? So I think you've talked about renewables, solar already, but just on hydrogen, I mean, it feels to me like we're at the start of the curve, maybe where renewables was 10 years ago. What is your thinking?
Well, in terms of, again, the cost. So 10 years ago, we're all saying renewable energy is so expensive. And of course, we knew what happened over the next 10 years, succeeding 10 years. Will that happen to hydrogen? Again, I'll probably hold back making a statement that yes, it will happen. But I think what's crucial here is to get the first large-scale hydrogen energy project operational. And then there are challenges in terms of building, let's say, for instance, the plan to use hydrogen as a substitute for coal in steel production. We're told that we need a 1 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity to be able to make that happen. Right now, the pilot plant is at 6 megawatts. So those are some of the hurdles that need to be addressed by innovators, by investors, by the demand sources of this market. So I think the main question is not just about the cost, but I mean, we are seeing climate litigation happening, let's say in Europe, because of the because of lack of commitment, let's say, to energy transition for some companies. So I think
so
it's
not just about reducing costs,
and the pressure is coming from external sources will mean this is going to happen more or less.
So as well as the bottom-up costs, it's also the top-down regulation and the government push for.
As I mentioned, hypothetically, it's cost-effective, but in the region because of low cost of renewable energy. But then you have two things: you've got polysilicon prices increasing, and hopefully that's just short-term. What if that's not short-term? And number two, we want the investors to sign the fine lines, right? The loans, the debts to finance these projects.
Just one final, very quick question before we move on to oil and gas. Where will the main off-takers be for hydrogen? Will it be? You mentioned industrial producers. You know, who will be the main off-takers?
So we've seen that the Uniper is the main off-taker for the Hyport Duqm project in Oman. So there are two. So hydrogen is like renewable energy, except that it's twice the risk, right? Because it's a more complex sort of supply chain. You've got to have a long-term agreement with the electrolyzer plant operator who will buy the renewable energy, and that electrolyzer company will have to sign a hydrogen purchase agreement with the off-taker, with the company that will use the hydrogen as an feedstock to whatever, where it's fertilizer or steel or petrochemical products. So it's those risks that the investment companies are looking at, I guess, in terms of supporting these projects, providing the debt for these projects.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. You've worked hard so far, so I'll give you a break for a moment. We'll move on to Indrajit and the oil and gas sector. Before I do, I just want to remind you that we have this new report, Middle East Energy Transition, time to coincide with today's broadcast. And if you look in your inbox emails, you'll find an email from me with the link to these, the free bundle of information about the report, or to special price bundles with the MEED.com subscription. So that you can either use the links on screen or in your email. Now, Indrajit, I've been teasing everyone, saying we're going to come to the oil and gas sector. So I've got a slide here, how energy transition affects Middle East oil. So just briefly, but before we go into the individual NOCs, what is the impact? What does all this mean for the national oil companies?
So I think when we speak about energy transition, obviously it has to be led by the NOCs, which have been squarely blamed for the carbon emissions and the greenhouse gas emissions in this region for decades. And they will have to take the lead, and they are taking the lead. We've seen several, there was a question about offtake agreements for blue hydrogen. There have been several in the past few weeks where Aramco and ADNOC both have sealed such commercial deals with stakeholders in Japan and South Korea. There are actual agreements in place. We're seeing shipments and cargoes of blue hydrogen going across to sort of North Asia. Itochu Corporation, Idemitsu, Inpex, Hyundai, they've all purchased sort of blue hydrogen cargoes from both Aramco and ADNOC. So in terms of the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a green, sort of green-led energy transition, there needs to be a buffer, which I think the blue hydrogen segment is capable enough of filling. And we're already seeing such actual agreements on ground happening as we speak. If I can just quickly run through this slide. Obviously, the first 2 points refer to global demand for oil declining or reaching a peak. There is no controversy about this anymore. I think OPEC also has conceded to the fact, although it has taken them years to actually concede that a peak oil demand is actually a phenomenon. But I think in September last year, they actually came out with a tacit acknowledgement that peak oil demand.
The question is, the debate is about when now, isn't it, rather than
right.
if?
It's essentially about when, not if. And I think the broad consensus is that it will happen sometime in the 2040s, depending upon where the economic development agenda lies in the world. I mean, obviously, it's quite lopsided. The recovery from the pandemic is at the moment, whereas we see the western part of the world picking up faster than the rest of the world. And the slower the economic recovery is from the pandemic, obviously the reliance on fossil fuels will be more than the actual move into energy transition. Obviously, during the lean period, shall we say, we've seen several NOCs like ADNOC, Aramco, and Qatar Petroleum, also to an extent BDO and Kuwait, take advantage, if I may say so, of the prevailing low costs in the market.
So when you talk about the lean period, you mean the COVID period, the past 18, 20 months?
Yes.
Or do you mean the 5 years since 2015?
I think a 5-year period to look at will be quite diverse and varied. We've had several such oil price cycles within those 5 years. But the current, or rather the latest downturn in the oil and gas industry in terms of prices has been the cascading effect of the pandemic on oil and gas demand. And what the NOCs essentially have done is obviously secure sort of low prices and things like low higher manas at low rates to form these framework agreements. I mean, just yesterday, and a lot of readers and the audience to this webinar would already know about this. Aramco signed $1 billion worth of energy engineering project agreements with 8 top engineering consultants in the world. Obviously, that's just the phase 1. There is another phase 2 that's coming up. So what they've essentially done is secured those long-term agreements, which will run through to 2026.
Okay, so what you're saying, I think, in terms of the oil companies, they're continuing to spend and invest because that's their business and they've got the low cost advantage. There's still a big future for oil and gas, and they're using the downturn to get lower prices, to push ahead, get lower prices from their contractors. I'm also interested in the new policies, the diversification strategies for the NOCs and any other strategies. So maybe if I can just click onto the next slide, which looks at sort of 5 key NOCs in the Gulf, and you could perhaps talk through the different strategies because they're not the same for everyone.
No,
so here we go. I've got Aramco, ADNOC, KPC, QP, and OQ in Oman. Perhaps if you could just sort of summarize the key themes from these.
No, obviously the NOCs are placed in different tangents when it comes to investing in energy transition. Aramco obviously seems to be a step ahead of the others. We alluded to the project with Hyundai in South Korea. So that's the first real investment in a project whereby they sell one of the primary products from the refining sector, which is LPG, and in return get the CO2 produced in the process to actually inject into the oil fields for enhancing the oil recovery rates. That's Aramco. Obviously, there are several other plans in place. ADNOC, again, they have entered into several such cooperation agreements and workshops with stakeholders in Japan and South Korea. Those are the 2 key countries which have shown a willingness to sort of engage with Middle East stakeholders, particularly in the Gulf, to actually sort of dive into the energy transition agenda. KPC, I'm afraid, obviously is falling behind from the rest of the others, but obviously they have plans in place to sort of catch up. Obviously, their 2040 energy agenda focuses very heavily on energy transition and producing renewable energy from conventional oil and gas projects. Qatar Petroleum is in a different tangent altogether. This is not to mean that they're not serious about energy transition. Obviously, they are. That's part of the whole Qatar vision for their energy future. But at the moment, they are quite fixated, shall I say, on the North Field energy project, which obviously will place them at the top of the LNG producers market, and not just put them in that spot, but also consolidate their lead by quite a margin. Australia currently is the world's largest LNG producer, but when the first phase of the North Field LNG project actually comes online, that will give Qatar an enviable lead in the LNG production market. OQ, obviously, a lot of their energy transition goals have been or are being carried forward by PDO, which is
just briefly introduce. You might want to tell people what OQ is, because they're relatively new. From 2019. People might not be aware as they are about Aramco or ADNOC.
Yeah, so OQ, obviously, like you said, Richard, was formed in 2019. They are the state energy holding company from which sort of takes care of the midstream through to the petrochemical sector in Oman. The upstream still is being handled by PDO, although now they are under the umbrella of EDO, Energy Development Oman, which is sort of the government-owned energy holding company for the upstream sector.
OQ, as well as having the hydrocarbons stuff, it also is responsible for renewables, isn't it? Or power generation, including renewables.
That is correct, which is why I mentioned, I think anything from the midstream sector onwards in the energy value chain through to renewable and power production is now under the responsibility of OQ. And in the upstream segment, it's still PDO taking the charge. Obviously, PDO's outgoing, or now past CEO, Mr. Raul Rastogi, had put very ambitious plans in place for PDO to advance their energy transition goals in terms of CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We already see on-ground realities taking place in Oman. OQ obviously is very focused on their renewable energy targets, as Jenny previously mentioned. And blue ammonia and blue hydrogen production obviously features very strongly in their narrative.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now we've got about 8 minutes left and there are lots of questions. Indrajit, 2 for you based on your comments just now. Can you clarify your statement regarding Aramco engineering hours agreement?
I think I was referring to the ADNOC engineering agreements, although Aramco, Aramco obviously has taken the leadership position when it comes to those framework agreements. They already have the General Engineering Services Plus, or GES Plus, which has sort of acted as a model for other NOCs to emulate. If you look at the agreements that ADNOC has signed yesterday with those 8 companies, it is pretty much fashioned along the lines of what ADNOC has done years back with those 5 entities there. So, and obviously Kuwait doesn't have that broad overarching framework agreements in place, but KIPIC, one of the KPC subsidiaries, the petrochemical industries complex, they have separate framework agreements with a bunch of 3 service providers for the Al Zour refining and petrochemical complex. And I think going forward, you'll see many more of these coming up in the region as NOCs look to take advantage of the low oil prices.
Okay, thank you very much. Jenny, just quickly, which country is at the leading edge for technology innovation for hydrogen production? So just in a sentence or two, where's the technology coming from?
Well, you've got the technology. Well, we see US and German companies basically, well, it depends on which part of the supply chain, right? So you've got Siemens and other companies supplying, building electrolyzer production plants. And then you've got companies like Air Products doing air separation or other forms of converting hydrogen into ammonia. So I think there isn't, I'm not sure if there is a clear country leader in terms of technologies, but these are the names that we've come across in terms of projects that have been announced in the region. And if we're referring to which country in the region is more advanced than the other, that's a hard question because it's there's still, I mean, you've got Masdar and Siemens and Marubeni doing a demonstrator plant in Masdar, and then you've got pilot plants being initiated in Egypt and Oman as well. So it's hard to say.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions, Jenny, about wind projects. We talked a lot about solar. What are your just brief thoughts on, are there any decent sized wind projects? Saudi Arabia has just brought its first wind project online, hasn't it? So what's the outlook for wind? Well,
I think, again, they are National Renewable Energy Program basically states how much solar PV and wind they wish to build over the next 10 years. So I think they're planning to build a second one in I think it's in Yanbu. I think they're finalizing the capacity of that wind project. It's huge, 850 megawatts basically, based on the initial plan. And then of course we've seen wind projects awarded and under construction and operational in North Africa as well. So I think and Dubai also recently, just a few days ago, announced its first wind project in Hatta. It's 28 megawatts, not as huge as the other projects, but I guess it's part of their plan to have this as part of their renewable energy capacity.
Okay, now somebody's asked about Algeria. I kind of skirted over Algeria, although it has the biggest pipeline of renewables projects or solar projects on its books. It's been very slow to bring much of that forward. So the question is, do you have any insights on Algeria's energy transition, the prospects for hydrogen and for renewables? Any thoughts on that?
Well, they have a plan, but the implementation has not been very impressive. But earlier this year, we did hear the government saying they're preparing the tender documents for 1 gigawatt solar PV project. That we have not seen a more recent development in terms of when the RFP will be issued. But I think the major issue with Algeria is the framework around it. The investment framework is not really encouraging private investors to get into the country. So I think that needs to be sorted out if they want their renewable energy plans to succeed in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. So we're just coming into the last few moments. I want to present a few sort of summary thoughts on what energy transition might mean for business, or at least some of the considerations that companies seeking opportunities in the energy transition might want to think about. So firstly, this region, and particularly as we've heard from Jenny and Indra, Abu Dhabi, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as well as Qatar, they want to lead the global energy transition. They're at the heart of the energy story today because they're leading oil producers and gas producers. They want to retain that position. And so we're seeing companies like Aqua Power and Masdar through Mubadala and PIF backing, really trying to sort of take a lead on investing in clean technology and clean technology IP, as well as developing large-scale, utility-scale hydrogen and renewables and waste-to-energy plants. I think another important factor is ESG, this growing need for investors and for governments to pursue environmentally, social and good governance policies, ESG policies. It's good for achieving, reducing carbon emissions and achieving net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And it's what governments and investors want. So if you're in business selling, that's a hook to pick on for the governments in this region. Green finance can bring down the cost. There are an increasing amount of green funds and green finance solutions for ESG verified, if you like, projects and services. In this region, as we've heard from Indrajit, the oil and gas companies are continuing to invest in traditional hydrocarbons, but they are diversifying as well into new projects. And there's a sort of blurring between the utilities and the oil companies as well, which we're seeing very clearly in Oman. But also we've heard about Aramco, for example, getting into renewables investment. And then there's the kind of blue-green hydrogen blurring as well. And so I think we're going to see increasing diversification of players in the renewables sector, and those oil companies shifting in that area too. The changing scope of projects, so this is not just the output products for projects, but also the consumption of energy, using digital data technology to optimize your asset, using digital twins to manage the life cycle performance and energy consumption of industrial facilities, refineries and buildings as well. And I think, as I was referring to earlier about EGA and Emirates Steel, there's going to be increasing tracking of the carbon footprint of the supply chain. So if you're feeding into any of these big consumers, there are changes in design scope requirements for projects, green buildings, new design standards, and that reflects changing consumer demand for energy efficient buildings, energy efficient offices, and energy efficient products. And that, of course, affects supplier requirements, as I mentioned, tracking the carbon footprint. So I think those are factors that anyone selling into this region needs to think about in the energy transition. I'm at the end of time now. I just want to remind you about this report, Middle East Energy Transition. It's available now, and it goes into a lot more detail than we've been able to cover in the past hour. And many of the questions that we haven't yet answered are answered in this report. And then just a final reminder, you can find out more about that report and other deals on the links on this slide, and you'll find the same links in your inbox in an email from me that was sent at the start of the webinar. So please take the opportunity to sort of investigate and find out more. And then finally, thank you very much. It's been we tried to cover a lot of ground, perhaps too much in such a short space of time. Thank you to Jenny and Indrajit for their time and their insights. Thank you to you for joining us today and for your questions, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day. See you.